So in 1989, again, Poland goes first. In October of 89, Hungary is next. But meanwhile, as Hungary is falling, they allow their border to be open to Austria. So while this is occurring, what happens is German citizens start to, who want to get to, who are in Berlin or in Eastern Europe, make vacation plans to Hungary, and then they travel across into freedom through Austria. So there's this loop system starts to happen where there's East Germans flooding into Hungary to then cross into the Austrian across the Austrian border. And so when we think of, again, the fall of the Berlin Wall falls actually quite late. People are moving already much earlier before that. November of 89, Czechoslovakia falls. The wall itself is going to fall in November of 1989. Again, these become kind of historic and picturesque movements at that time period. It doesn't end well in 1989, though. In December of 1989, Romania's government falls, and this was under the leadership of the terrible dictator Nicolae Ceausescu. And Ceausescu was this horrible dictator and repressive leader of a repressive government in Romania, and he's basically lynched. The crowds go after him in December of 1989 on Christmas. He's captured by the crowds basically and executed. And the new government's going to form. It's not going to be as democratic as the West would hope. And this is what happens in 89 too, so it's hard to see how it's going to play out in the new leadership. Most of Central Europe becomes very liberalized very quickly with democratic governments, but they have to then liberalize their economy. That means hardship for the people. They've had price controls for 50 years. They haven't had a competition of products and goods for 50 years. All this is going to flood in from the Western markets, and the companies and the industries of this region are all going to collapse, and some are going to be sold off, and who's going to buy them? Well, sometimes they're going to be bought by Western interests, sometimes they're bought by the old communist guard, those who had money, more money than anyone else. And this is, again, it's very problematic in Eastern Europe even today, because those who were the oppressors often cases became the benefactors of the change. They became multimillionaires and super wealthy individuals. And sometimes if you were part of the military leadership, you had access to buying these companies and such. I had a former student, whose father I think would fit this description, and he was a naval officer. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, he ended up having basically a fleet of ships, of private ships. And he's a shipping magnate, and his child used to come to school with a driver and a bodyguard and a limo every day to school. And so there's this whole new rich, nouveau riche group of individuals, many of them old communist apparatchiks, people of the higher echelon of the party. So the changes aren't always very positive in some of these areas, and people find that they don't have enough money to eat, and all the forces of westernization didn't bring necessary wealth to everyone. And that's what a lot of people thought. They thought democracy equals wealth. They think if they had a democratic government, they could have the same living standards as West Germans or the French. But that, again, is going to take a long time, and that process was very hard. And some governments try to protect the people by keeping a lot of social welfare programs to keep people keep a large safety net, and were unable to keep a lot of promises, and governments are going to fall and change very quickly in this time period. I was in Hungary in 1994, and 5 years after the fall, the leadership had turned to some of the old communist leaders who now expressed that they were now democratic leaders, but it shows how the desperation many people felt, and you never knew what was on the store shelves and if it was going to be there next week. My husband and I would scan every single item in the stores nearby us, hoping that something would appear. 1 week you'd have canned tomatoes, and then you wouldn't see them again for 6 months. So, and that kind of represented the time period during these changes. And I remember seeing old ladies selling turnips on the streets and things like this, because just to try to make extra money. So a lot of poverty entered into this area that wasn't seen, or hadn't been seen since the war, and that scared a lot of people. And so there's always this nationalist right movement in Eastern Europe even today that is oftentimes fighting for changes to bring back that kind of security. And some of these movements these sometimes are very right-wing and very violent and very nationalistic, very anti-immigrant and such, because they think that will somehow solve these problems. And there's been varying degrees of success, and depends where you go. Hungary, for example, has done very well. Estonia has done very well. Poland, it's had troubles, and those troubles have really just started changing around in the last couple of years, but in the 90s were very difficult in Poland. But again, this is another story we can't get involved with here. Let me tell you what happened with Gorbachev. So in 1989, when these revolutions are happening, Gorbachev doesn't interfere, doesn't intervene, and that's the key. No tanks are sent. And many people were kind of waiting. Is it going to happen? Is the Soviet Union, going to crush its neighbors? It doesn't happen. So what happens internally is it starts to break up internally. Those border nations, for example, the Baltics and Ukraine and some of the Stan nations, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, these are all used to be former republics of the Soviet Union. They all start fighting for freedom. In 1991, Gorbachev reluctantly allows some of these to go, for example, in the Baltics. And because Gorbachev is allowing for the collapse, in many ways, of the Soviet Union, allowing for the breakup of the Soviet Union, there's going to be counter-revolutionary forces within. So the old guard kidnaps Gorbachev in 1991, and he was in his vacation dacha on the Black Sea coast, and the military surrounded his vacation home, and we're going to try and declare martial law in Moscow and other places. But again, there's a new political will, and the people of Russia had seen what happened in Eastern Europe, and Boris Yeltsin emerges as a democratic force against the military, and he's able to unite the people in Moscow and some of the military leadership to go with him. And the revolution happens kind of, again, with a kind of a gasping of air. The government basically falls because the political will to continue it is not there. You needed the military might to be fully on their side. The old guard didn't have it. These 80-year-old men who've been trying to do things the same way didn't have the political will to continue it, and didn't have the force of the party around them to make it happen. Boris Yeltsin emerges as the new leadership. Gorbachev ends up going into exile, and is really, even today, seen in terms of shame. The Russians hate Gorbachev, hate him. In America, he's the most celebrated leader of Russia. You know, he teaches, I don't know if he's at Harvard or Yale, he teaches at a big university today, and he does all these book tours and speaking engagements. But in Russia, they think he's terrible, because they see him as bringing down the power structure of the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union was big and powerful. That means something to the Russian people, just like it means something to Americans as well. America would be shamed to no longer be a world leader, and that's what happened under the Yeltsin era. Russia, the newer Russia that emerges, the Soviet Union collapsed, was very weak, and the people suffer terribly under the changes that happened, and there's rampant inflation and political corruption from the very top all through society. Yeltsin was very corrupt, and the U.S. And Western nations poured a tremendous amount of money that just disappeared into Swiss bank accounts throughout, with Russian names on those accounts. And today, when we look at why Putin is very powerful in Russia, it's because he brings back that prestige and that power to the Russian people, and that's why they love Putin. They hate Gorbachev, they hated Yeltsin, and so they equate a lot of that with democracy. And democracy is on very weak footing today in the Soviet Union, based on this loss of prestige and power.